Outside Silver Canyon Station, Arizona Territory, April 1874. The wind cut like iron filings. It hissed across the dry plain, scraping sand against the rocks until everything sounded like a whetstone against bone. By mid-morning, the sun was already high enough to bleach the sky to white. The land had no mercy in it. I was riding south toward Silver Canyon Station, my horse half asleep, my thoughts not far behind. The trail was empty, just me, the wind, and the creak of saddle leather. I'd left the army years ago but couldn't quite stop moving. A man who's lost faith in himself tends to keep riding until something stops him. That something came just past a bend in the wash. At first I thought it was a dead tree. Then I saw the movement, a shape caught against the trunk, swaying with the wind. I pulled the reins. My horse snorted, uneasy. She was there, tied to a cedar stump at the edge of the ravine, wrists bound with coarse rope, her dress torn and dust-stained. Her hair hung loose, black and tangled, and her face was streaked with dirt and dried blood. She looked half ghost, half miracle. Her eyes found me before I spoke. "Don't," she rasped, voice barely there. "They'll come back." I swung off the horse anyway. "Who?" She tried to swallow. "Men. Hunting." The rope cut deep into her skin. I drew my knife, sawed through the knots. She staggered once the tension broke, catching herself against the tree. I offered my canteen. She didn't take it right away, just stared like she couldn't believe anyone still stopped for a stranger. When she finally drank, her hands trembled so hard the water spilled down her chin. "Name's Jonah Reed," I said. "You got one?" "Ayanna." Her voice was soft, careful, as if the desert might punish her for saying it. "Who tied you here, Ayanna?" "Men from Dyer's camp," she said. "They trade people like horses." I felt my jaw set. Marshall Dyer called himself law out here, but everyone knew he was just another wolf wearing a badge. Before I could ask more, the wind shifted. Hoofbeats, faint but close. Ayanna froze, her gaze darting toward the ridge. I heard it then, voices carried thin through the heat. "They're coming," she whispered. I looked around. Nowhere to hide but the open desert and the horse that could carry one, maybe two if luck held. I shrugged off my duster, heavy canvas, stiff with dust. She stared, confused. "Get under," I said. Her lips parted. For a heartbeat the wind seemed to stop, the world holding its breath. "May I hide under your coat?" she asked. The words a prayer more than a question. "Reckon that's what it's for," I said. I threw the coat over her shoulders, wrapping her small frame tight, and lifted her onto the saddle. I swung up behind her just as the first riders crested the rise. 4 of them, silhouettes against the sun, rifles glinting. "Ride," she breathed. I kicked the horse hard. We tore down the dry wash, gravel exploding under hooves. Bullets whined past like angry bees. One clipped a rock near my boot. Another sang past my ear. Ayanna ducked low beneath the coat, gripping the saddle horn. Her body trembled against mine, but she didn't scream. We hit the flats at full gallop. The wind ripped tears from my eyes, the coat flapping behind us like a tattered flag. The men shouted, spurred their mounts harder. I veered toward a ravine. I knew a dry cut that twisted through the mesas. If we reached it, the walls would hide us. The horse stumbled once, caught itself. I whispered a curse, leaned low. The trail dropped sharp into the ravine, too narrow for comfort. Perfect. We plunged in. Dust and echo swallowed us whole. The shouts faded above. When the sound died completely, I pulled the horse up beneath an overhang. Both of us were gasping, the horse, the girl, and me. She turned slowly, eyes bright with something between terror and disbelief. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said. "Maybe not." "Then why?" I didn't have an answer that made sense. I just knew I couldn't keep riding after seeing her like that, tied to a tree like an offering no god had asked for. "You can rest a while," I said. "Then we move." She looked down at the coat still wrapped around her, fingers tracing the bullet hole near the hem. "Your coat smells like smoke and rain," she murmured. "Means it's been through both." Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying distant voices, but this time farther off, lost in the maze of stone. For the first time since I'd laid eyes on her, she breathed without shaking. I checked the horizon through the cracks in the rock, then looked back at her. Her eyes met mine, Steady now. Jonah, she said quietly. If they find us, they won't, I cut in. She nodded, though she didn't look convinced. I wasn't either. Still, for that one moment, hidden under my coat and the shadow of the canyon, the world felt small enough to defend. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. By the time the sun dropped behind the mesas, the heat had bled out of the earth. The air cooled fast, the way desert nights always do. One moment fire, the next ice. Shadows stretched long and thin, spilling like black water across the hardpan. We'd ridden until both horse and woman were near spent. The animal's sides frothed white. The girl swayed in the saddle, her head dipped low. I found a half-collapsed barn I used sometimes when I needed to be away from town. The roof sagged, the fence leaned, but the walls still stood. It would do. I helped her down. Her knees gave a little, but she caught herself on the rail. Rope burns crossed her wrists, angry and red. I gave her a strip of cloth, torn from my own sleeve, and she wrapped them tight without a word. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cedar smoke long dead. A coyote howled somewhere out in the basin, the sound carrying like a lonely hymn. I stirred up the old pit until I found blackened coals, then coaxed a flame from dry twigs. The glow flickered, revealing the rough lines of the barn and her face streaked with dirt, but proud, carved fine as flint. Apache blood, I guessed. The kind of strength the desert breeds, not soft, but shaped by scarcity, polished by pain. She sat near the fire, hands outstretched, palms trembling in the heat. Steam rose from her skin, where sweat met cold air. I set down my rifle and took off my hat. You can rest easy, I said. They won't track this far tonight. Her eyes didn't leave the fire. They always track, she said. Maybe, but I know this land better. She turned to me then, really looked. Beneath the soot, her gaze was clear, wary, intelligent, the kind of eyes that memorized escape routes before names. You're not law, she said. No. Then why help me? I shrugged. Seemed wrong, leaving you tied to a tree. Blah. She studied me for a long time, the fire painting gold into her dark irises. Finally she said, Wrong, don't stop men like them. I'm not men like them. The words fell heavy. I wasn't sure I believed them myself. Silence filled the barn, soft as dust settling. The wind moaned low through the cracks, whispering secrets from a land that never forgot its dead. I handed her half my can of beans. She ate slow, careful, like she hadn't had food that wasn't stolen or thrown in weeks. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and studied me again. You don't talk much, Jonah Reed. Not much left worth saying. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Then I'll do the talking. You listen. So I did. She spoke of the canyons she'd crossed, the nights hiding from riders with chains, the sound of coyotes that reminded her of home of her mother's songs in Navajo, soft and low, sung to keep storms away. She told me about the village that vanished under the greed of a railroad crew, about the uncle who died for nothing but standing in their path. Her voice wavered but never broke. I didn't interrupt. Sometimes the telling itself is the medicine. When her words ran out, I poured her a tin cup of water. The firelight painted her skin bronze and gold. For a long while, we just listened to the desert breathe. Outside, the stars came on, millions of them, cold and sharp. The land was too wide for lies here. It stripped you down until only truth fit. Tomorrow, I said quietly, we ride for Dry Creek. It's quiet there. Folks keep to themselves. You got a place? She asked. Used to. Still standing. Far as I know. You'd take me there? I met her eyes. You saved my life when you asked me to stop. Her brow furrowed. I didn't save you. You did. A man who doesn't stop for anything's already dead. I just hadn't noticed. Loaf. She looked away, but I saw her jaw tighten not in pride, but in understanding. The kind of silence that follows truth hung between us, dense enough to hear your own heart against it. I leaned back against a beam and stared at the roof where a piece of sky shone through a hole. You ever think the desert remembers everything we do? She tilted her head. Maybe that's why it never forgives. The wind shifted again. It carried the smell of sage and something faintly sweet, night-blooming cactus. She pulled my coat tighter around her shoulders, the fabric too large, swallowing her whole. I used to think coats were just for keeping out cold, she murmured. But it feels like yours is keeping out the world. I've been trying to keep the world out for years, I said. Her eyes flicked up, unreadable. Has it worked? I gave a dry laugh. You tell me. 1. Later, when the fire burned low, I spread my bedroll near the door. She lay near the wall, still wrapped in my coat. The wind slipped through the cracks, whispering across the floor like something alive. Sometime past midnight, a sound woke me, a rustle, soft as fabric moving. I opened my eyes to find her sitting upright, staring toward the door. Yona? Yeah? If they come again, she said, voice barely above the wind, you don't have to fight for me. I propped up on an elbow. You asked me once why I helped you. Maybe I owe someone. Who? A man I shot long ago. He looked a little like you. The firelight flickered across her face. For a heartbeat, I thought she might ask more. But she didn't. She just lay back down, whispering something in her language, a prayer, maybe. I listened until her breathing steadied. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The ghosts never let it. When dawn cracked open the sky, pale and cold, I rose to saddle the horse. The world was hushed, painted in soft gold. She stood beside me, quiet, braiding her hair with strips of leather cut from the torn hem of her dress. Her wrists were still raw, but she didn't flinch when the braid pulled tight. The horse stamped once, eager for movement. I tied the last knot on the saddle and checked the rifle. She watched, calm now. Do you trust me? I asked, surprising myself. She hesitated, then said, I trust the land, and maybe you're part of it. Of loot. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. We rode west while the light was still soft, the world waking slow around us, quail darting from brush, lizards sunning on rocks, the air warming by degrees. I led the way through an old cattle path, half-eaten by sand. She followed without question. At one point, we crossed a dry riverbed where white bones lay scattered among the reeds, not human, but close enough to make you wonder. She said nothing, and neither did I. By mid-morning, we stopped to rest under a dead cottonwood. She knelt beside a patch of cactus, broke off a pad, and peeled it with her knife. The sap inside gleamed like silver. For burns, she said, pressing some onto my cracked knuckles. For skin, for the past. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We rode again, through silence, through heat. Somewhere along that road, I realized her breathing had synced with mine, steady. Sure, 2 rhythms finding the same pace. By noon, the outline of my old ranch rose out of the dust, fences broken, roof sagging, but still there. The windmill creaked like an old prayer refusing to die. Home enough for 2 souls too tired to run. I dismounted first and held out my hand. She looked at it for a long moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, warm, alive. Welcome to Dry Creek, I said. Her gaze swept over the land, the brittle grass, the cracked trough, the stubborn cedar tree by the gate. It's beautiful, she whispered. I smiled faintly. You're the first person to ever call it that. She glanced at me, eyes soft with something unspoken. Maybe you just needed new eyes to see it. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of the world shift, just a little. Like the ground beneath us was giving permission to start over. We led the horse toward the barn, our shadows long in the noon light. Somewhere above, a hawk circled once and let out a cry, sharp, clear, endless. It sounded like freedom. If you like Wild West love stories, or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second, and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. The first day at Dry Creek was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears until you started hearing your own heartbeat. The place hadn't seen life in years. Chickens long gone, troughs dry, fences half buried in sand. But the well still drew water if you knew how to coax the rope just right. I'd built that pulley myself back when I believed this land could be tamed. It still worked stubborn, like everything else that refused to die out here. Ayanna set to work without being told. She swept the porch, patched a torn window with an old feed sack, scrubbed soot off the hearth until her hands were gray. She moved like she'd been fixing broken things her whole life, people, places, maybe herself. I chopped wood out by the shed, splitting logs until the blisters opened again. I told myself the work was necessary, but the truth was I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The silence of the place felt different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It had weight, like the pause between two breaths, when neither of you wants to be the first to break it. By evening, the air smelled of stew. She'd found wild onions near the creek and added beans from my stores. The scent drifted through the doorway, smoke, salt, and something warm I hadn't smelled in years. Home. We ate outside, sitting on the steps with tin bowls balanced on our knees. The sun was bleeding itself out behind the red cliffs, and the light painted her face in amber and gold. When I thanked her, she shook her head. "You gave me a roof. You made it worth sleeping under," I said. That drew the faintest smile, small but real, the kind that sits on the mouth for a second before the person remembers it's allowed to stay. The days that followed fell into rhythm chores, repairs, and long stretches of wordless company. Mornings began with the hiss of the coffee pot and the rasp of her broom on the porch. By midday the sun would hammer down, and I'd hear the thud of her footsteps on the hard ground as she went to fetch water. I showed her where the spring fed the trough, how to test the rope before lowering the bucket, how to spot rattlers by the shimmer of scales in the grass. She learned fast, steady, never wasted a word. In turn, she taught me things I didn't know I'd forgotten. Which cactus held water clear enough to drink, the herbs that pull heat from burns, how to tell a dry storm from one that brings rain. She spoke with her hands when words failed, tracing the air like she was remembering old prayers. Sometimes I caught myself watching her while she worked, and I'd look away quick, ashamed of the thought that followed, that the place didn't look half as dead when she was in it. One afternoon, the wind turned strong from the west. Dust rolled off the plains, swallowing the yard in a pale haze. We took shelter inside, doors barred, windows shut. The storm hit hard sand hissing against the boards, roof groaning. Ayanna sat cross-legged by the fire, combing out her hair with her fingers. She asked me about the scars on my arm, the old ones that looked like white ropes under the skin. I told her about Shiloh, about a bullet that had torn through a friend before it found me. She listened without pity, only nodding. Then she said, "In my tribe, scars are the places where the spirit remembers." "Then mine remembers too damn much," I said. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Maybe remembering keeps you from becoming like them." When the storm passed, the world outside smelled clean again, rinsed of dust and noise. The barn roof had lost a few shingles, but the house still stood. We both laughed small, surprised laughter that felt like something breaking loose inside the chest. The next morning, I found her by the creek, crouched low, washing the soot from her face. The water shimmered around her wrists. For a moment, she didn't know I was watching. She looked young again, almost peaceful. I turned away, feeling like I'd stepped into a prayer that wasn't mine. Later that week, she found my old uniform folded in a chest at the back of the bedroom. The blue coat with brass buttons, dulled by time and guilt. She brought it out, holding it by the shoulders. "You were Union," she said. "Once," I answered. Her eyes narrowed. "Did you kill any of my people?" The question struck deep and clean. I stared at the floorboards. The truth weighed heavy on the tongue. Yes, she didn't move. The fire popped once, loud in the silence. Then she said quietly, "You could have lied. Wouldn't have fixed the truth." She studied me a long while, then folded the coat back slow this time, like handling something holy. "Then maybe that's your penance," she said, "to help one of us live." The words stayed with me all day, clinging like smoke. That night, I sat outside while the wind combed through the dry grass. The moon was thin, sharp as a blade. Inside, she hummed a tune in a language older than this land's borders. The melody slid through the cracks of the door like smoke, soft and haunting. I didn't understand a single word, but it made something in me ache, the kind of ache that doesn't hurt so much as remind you you're still alive. For the first time in years, I let it pull the pain out instead of fighting it. After a while, she stepped onto the porch. The moonlight silvered her skin. She didn't stop humming until she sat down beside me. "That song," I said, "what does it mean?" "It asks the wind to carry the names of the lost," she said. "So they're never forgotten." We sat in silence, listening to the wind carry its invisible burden. She looked out toward the dark horizon. "Do you ever think the land keeps the voices of the dead?" "All the time," I said. "Out here you can almost hear them if you're still enough." Her gaze flicked toward me. "Maybe that's why you stay in places no one else will." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just don't know where else to go." She reached down, took a pinch of dust, and let it sift through her fingers. "Then the wind will carry you too someday." It sounded more like a blessing than a threat. The following morning dawned bright and cool. We rebuilt the corral fence together, hammering new nails where the old ones had rusted loose. Every strike of the hammer echoed into the empty valley. "Your arm's healing," she said after a while. "Not bad for a man who got shot at for half his life," she smirked. "Maybe the land's decided to keep you alive a little longer." "Why's that?" "So you can learn how to listen." The hammer paused mid-swing. I didn't ask what she meant. I was starting to understand. Toward sunset, clouds gathered low over the mesas. The light turned copper. She stood by the fence, watching lightning crawl along the rim of the sky. I came up beside her, resting my hands on the rail. "Storm's coming," I said. She nodded. "Good. The ground's thirsty." Thunder rolled far off, low and slow, like a drumbeat from another world. When the rain finally came, it hit hard and sudden, washing the dust from everything. We stood under the eaves, soaked through but laughing anyway. The land smelled alive again. And for that one wild moment, I forgot what it felt like to be hollow. Inside later, she wrung out her hair by the fire. I handed her a towel. She took it, eyes catching mine. The quiet stretched long enough for a man to drown in. "You ever wonder," she said softly, "if we were meant to meet?" "I stopped believing in meant to," I said. "Then believe in the part after the choice." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only honest answer a man's got. When she finally drifted off to sleep by the hearth, I watched the flames die down to coals. Her breathing was slow, steady. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper. I realized then that the ache in my chest wasn't guilt anymore. It was something quieter, older hope, maybe. The dangerous kind, the kind you don't want to name for fear it might hear you. I sat there until dawn, the first light turning the wet fields silver. For once, I didn't mind the ghosts. They felt almost at peace. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you." Summer rolled in hard, mean as a fever. The earth cracked open like dry lips, and the air shimmered above the plain in waves that twisted the horizon. The smell of hot dust clung to everything, to skin, to cloth, to the soul. Even the birds had given up on song. By then, we'd learned to share silence so well it felt like speech. We didn't need words for what we already knew: how to move around each other, when to reach for a cup, when to leave space. She had taken to wearing my old shirt when the days turned cruel. Sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair braided back tight. It made her look fierce and steady, like she'd always belonged to this land and I was just catching up. That morning, I'd fixed the hinge on the corral gate while she hung laundry near the line, the white fabric flashing like small flags against the Sunday. The world was still for once, no wind, no sound. Then, from far off, I heard it. Hooves. Faint at first, like distant thunder, then clearer, a rhythm too controlled to be wild mustangs. Riders. I straightened, squinting toward the southern ridge. A dust plume rose there, slow and deliberate. My stomach went cold. 4 of them, heading straight for us. "Duyas men." Ayana looked up from the wash, reading my face before I could speak. She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. "Go inside," I said. She didn't argue, but she didn't hide either. She moved to the porch, took the rifle from where it leaned against the door, and checked the chamber just as I'd shown her weeks before. Her hands didn't shake this time. I watched the way the sun caught the barrel, clean, straight, certain. The riders came in fast, dust curling around their boots as they reined in near the gate. They didn't bother to dismount. Their laughter carried thin on the wind. "Jonah Reed," the lead one called. His voice had that oily drawl of a man who liked hearing his own name. "You keeping a prize from the marshal?" "She's no one's prize," I said. He grinned, all yellow teeth and arrogance. "Then you won't mind if we take her back. Man's got to eat, and a woman fetches a fine price." I stepped forward, shotgun in hand. "You cross that gate, you won't step back out." They laughed, the cruel kind that tastes like whiskey and rot. The lead rider spat into the dust. "Don't make this holy, Reed. You ain't that kind of man." The sun burned straight overhead, white and merciless. I could feel the sweat slide down my spine. Then the first shot cracked. Not from them, from her. Ayanna's bullet whistled clean through the air and took the hat clean off the lead rider's head. It spun once before landing in the dirt between his boots. The smile vanished. "Hellfire," he barked, jerking his reins. The fight came fast and hard, like every gunfight does. Too much noise, too much light, not enough time to think. The first bullet from their side splintered the porch rail near Ayanna's shoulder. She ducked, fired again, steady as a hawk. I swung around the wagon, firing from cover. The blast echoed off the canyon walls. One of the riders caught a bullet in the leg and toppled sideways. His horse screamed, wild-eyed. The others fanned out, trying to flank. A bullet tore through my sleeve and bit deep into my shoulder. The pain was white-hot, like someone driving a nail straight through bone. I stumbled but stayed upright, teeth locked tight. Ayanna moved fast, reloading with the calm of a born survivor. She dropped another man, a clean shot to the hand that sent his gun spinning into the dirt. The last two turned mean. They rushed us, guns blazing, hooves tearing up the yard. I rolled behind a trough and fired blind. My second shot found its mark horse, not man, but enough to throw him down. The fourth one saw his odds dying quick. He turned his mount, cursing, dragging his wounded partner toward the ridge. The sound of retreating hooves faded into the shimmering heat. Then silence, the kind that rings in your ears, long after the shooting stops. When the dust cleared, I was on my knees, blood soaking through my sleeve, dripping slow onto the cracked earth. The world tilted. Ayanna was beside me in an instant, pressing a strip of cloth against the wound. Her eyes were wide but steady. "Stay with me," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." We both knew that wasn't a promise a man should make, but she believed it anyway. She tore another strip from her shirt and tied it tight around my arm. "It's deep," she muttered. "I've had worse. Not on my watch." The way she said it, soft but fierce, made me believe it might be true. The yard smelled of blood and gunpowder, sharp and bitter. The laundry flapped above us, streaked with dust. Beyond the gate, the horizon shimmered empty again, no riders, no sound, only heat. She helped me inside, half dragging, half carrying. I collapsed onto the bed, vision swimming. The room spun walls, ceiling, her face blurring in and out. She cleaned the wound with water from the well, biting her lip hard as she poured. I hissed through my teeth, but she didn't flinch. "You talk too much when you're hurt," she said. I wasn't talking. Exactly. That almost made me laugh. Almost. When the bleeding slowed, she covered the wound with a cloth soaked in aloe and cedar ash. The smell filled the room sharp, earthy, alive. "You know your medicine," I murmured. "My mother taught me," she said. She said, "Even the desert has mercy if you know where to look." That night, I drifted in and out of fever. Every time I opened my eyes, she was there by the fire, humming that same tune. Sometimes her shadow moved across the wall like smoke. Sometimes I thought it was a spirit watching over me. I dreamt of cedar smoke and rain, of the day I'd found her bound to that tree. Only this time, it was me tied there, and she was the one cutting me free. When I woke fully, the fire was low. The moonlight fell across her face where she'd slumped asleep in the chair beside me, head resting on her arm. I could see the soot on her cheek, the dark circles under her eyes. She looked so small then, but there was a strength in her even sleep couldn't soften. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing against the shutters. The house creaked but held. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, long and lonely. I thought of the men who'd fled. Dyer wouldn't let this go. He'd send more next time, maybe come himself. But right then, with her breathing soft beside me, I couldn't care. The next morning, I tried to get up. She pushed me back down with one hand. "Don't be stupid," she said. "Stupid's how I got this far. Then maybe it's time you tried smart." I smiled, and it hurt. She fed me spoonfuls of stew, slow and steady. Her hands were rough from work, but gentle all the same. The kind of gentle that only comes from surviving cruelty. Outside, the yard bore the scars of the fight bullet holes in the fence, trampled earth, the dark stain where blood had dried. But the sky above it was impossibly blue, pure, like the world was pretending it hadn't just tried to kill us. She stood at the doorway later, looking out at it all. Her braids swung against her back as she said, almost to herself, "They'll come again, I know. Then we'll be ready." I wanted to tell her she didn't have to stay, that she could still run, still find somewhere safer, but I couldn't form the words, because deep down, I didn't want her to go. Instead, I said, "If they come, I'll be standing." She turned, eyes sharp as obsidian. Not alone. For a long time, neither of us moved. The sunlight cut through the window and landed across her face, and I saw something there, not fear, not anger, but the steady light of someone who's decided to live. That night, the fever broke. She was there when I opened my eyes, sitting cross-legged on the floor, cleaning her rifle. She looked up and smiled. "Still breathing," she said. "Disappointed?" Her laugh was small and tired, but beautiful all the same. "Not this time." When I finally slept again, I dreamed of rain, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that heals. I dreamed of cedar trees growing green where the earth had burned, and when I woke to the sound of her voice humming that same old tune, I realized something I hadn't dared to admit before, that for the first time since the war, I wasn't afraid to stay alive. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. I woke to sunlight. It spilled across the room in thin gold threads, moving slow over the floorboards, catching the dust that danced like ghosts of all the lives this house had seen. My shoulder ached where the bullet had gone through, a dull, steady pain that reminded me I was still here, still breathing. Ayana sat by the window, sewing. The light caught her hair and turned it copper where it fell across her face. She didn't look up at first. Her fingers moved quick and sure, stitching a tear in one of my shirts. Outside, the windmill creaked, slow and lazy, like even it had decided to rest. When she finally noticed me watching, she smiled small, weary, real. "Thought you might sleep forever," she said. "Not yet," I managed. The room was filled with the smell of morning dry earth, coffee, and faint cedar smoke from last night's fire. I could hear birds outside, picking at the seeds along the fence line. The land shimmered gold beneath the early light, life creeping back into the quiet. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. Days blurred into weeks after that. The wound healed slow, but steady. We rebuilt what the fire and the bullets had taken, plank by plank, nail by nail. I worked the fence line while she mended the roof, her hair tied back with a strip of old cloth. The rhythm of living returned to us, measured not by fear or flight, but by the sound of the hammer and the scrape of her broom. Sometimes she sang while she worked, low and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the land itself. The words were in her tongue, soft, winding, filled with sounds I couldn't place. I never asked what they meant. Some things aren't meant to be translated. Some things are truer when they stay in their own language. The evenings were the best of it. The heat would break just before dusk, and the sky would go from orange to violet, the mesa edges glowing like embers. We'd sit on the porch with mugs of coffee gone cold, listening to the frogs start up by the creek. She'd braid her hair again while I whittled wood into shapes that didn't need to be anything. Just motion, just time passing. Sometimes she'd catch me watching her, and I'd look away quick. Other times I didn't. She didn't mind. Once, a storm rolled through from the west, big and wild, lightning flashing so close you could feel the air split open. The wind howled down the chimney, carrying the scent of wet sage and dust. We stayed by the fire that night, the house shaking around us. When thunder cracked right above, she reached out without thinking, her hand finding mine. Her fingers were calloused, strong, warm. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. After that, we didn't talk about leaving. The next morning, everything smelled new again, the way only the desert can after rain. The soil steamed, the air heavy and alive. I walked the yard, boots sinking a little into the softened earth. Small green shoots were already pushing through the cracks. Life, stubborn as hell. Ayanna came to stand beside me. She was barefoot, her toes covered in mud, her face lifted toward the Sunday. "The land remembers," she said. I nodded. "So do we." "Oh." Weeks later, I caught her teaching a young jackrabbit how to eat from her hand. It had wandered in from the scrub and never left. She named it Smoke. Said it was too fast to be caught but too curious to stay gone. Like her. Maybe. I started fixing the barn roof for good, then proper beams, not the patchwork I'd used for years. She worked beside me, passing nails, holding boards steady. She didn't need direction. She already knew the rhythm of the place. By late summer, the ranch began to look almost whole again. The fences were straight. The corral held steady. The windmill creaked with pride instead of fatigue. And for the first time since I could remember, there was laughter, soft, uncertain, but real, echoing through the yard. One evening, as the sky blazed orange over the Cedar Hills, we stood side by the gate. The day had been long hauling feed, mending rope, but the kind of long that left you tired in the body, not the soul. She rested her hands on the rail, eyes fixed on the horizon. "At first," she said, "I only wanted to hide." I nodded. There was no need to ask from what. We both knew the shape of running. "But now," she went on, her voice low, "I want to stay where I can breathe." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of rain from far off. The cedar branches swayed, whispering like old friends. I looked at her, then really looked. The way the dying light touched her skin, the steadiness in her stance, the faint scar on her wrist where the rope had once cut deep. And I realized I'd been breathing easier ever since that day in the desert, since the moment I lifted that coat and gave her shadow to hide in. She reached for my hand. I let her. No words, no vows, no promises of forever, just the quiet understanding of two people who'd stopped running. We stood there as the storm crawled over the mesa, lightning flickering like the pulse of a new life. Rain came slow, gentle this time, tapping the roof like a lullaby. She turned toward me, rainlight in her eyes, and smiled. "If you've made it this far," I said softly, my voice rough from disuse, "I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments." She blinked, puzzled. "What did you say?" "Nothing," I said with a half smile. "Just something I tell the wind sometimes." She laughed, the kind of laugh that makes everything lighter. "The world still holds its scars, and so do we. The land never forgets its burns, its floods, its long seasons of silence. But somewhere under this cedar sky, healing found us slow, stubborn, and alive." In the weeks that followed, we planted again, not much, just enough. Corn, beans, a patch of herbs she said were good for both the body and the spirit. When they sprouted, she sang that same old tune, the one that first found me half dead and half hoping. Only now it sounded different, brighter. Every morning, I'd wake before her and sit on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the light spread over the hills. Sometimes I'd see a hawk circling far off, and I'd think of the man I used to be, the one who never stopped long enough to notice what was worth keeping. That man was gone now, buried somewhere between the cedar roots and the silence we'd learned to share. Ayanna would come out after a while, barefoot, hair loose, eyes half asleep. She'd lean on the doorframe, take a deep breath, and say the same thing every morning. "It's a good day to stay alive." And every morning, I'd nod, because she was right. The world beyond the mesa still burned with its cruelties, dyers' men, greed, hunger, lawless roads. But here, in this small piece of dust and wood and memory, we'd built something that felt like mercy. Maybe that's all love ever is out here, not the grand kind that fills books, but the quiet kind that mends fences and brews coffee and makes a man look forward to tomorrow. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the